Three senior American figures did not simply arrive at an aircraft carrier on the morning of February 8, 2026. They arrived at the physical intersection of failed diplomacy, accelerating military risk, and narrowing political options, landing aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln in the Arabian Sea, less than a day after negotiations with Iran in Oman ended without progress. And while public messaging framed the visit as a routine morale stop, meant to thank sailors for their service, the timing alone immediately exposed that explanation as incomplete. Because senior negotiators do not leave collapsed talks and immediately board a forward-deployed nuclear-powered carrier unless diplomacy has reached a point where contingency planning is no longer abstract, especially given what had unfolded only days earlier when an Iranian unmanned aerial vehicle flew directly toward the carrier strike group and penetrated deeply enough into its defensive envelope that American pilots were forced to scramble and destroy it, an incident that should not occur under normal conditions given the layered radar coverage, escort vessels, airborne early warning systems, electronic warfare assets, and constant combat air patrols protecting a U.S. carrier. And yet it happened, forcing planners to confront uncomfortable questions about how Iran tracked the ship's movement, how accurate its targeting data had become, whether the drone was acting independently or as part of a wider reconnaissance network, and whether external intelligence support was already feeding real-time information into Iranian command systems, which is why the visiting delegation did not simply tour the flight deck for photographs, but met directly with the F-35 pilot who conducted the interception, reviewed timelines, engagement distances, sensor detection gaps, and command decision loops, and spoke with sailors who understood that the drone was not a provocation for headlines, but a probe designed to test response thresholds, reaction times, and rules of engagement. All while Iranian leadership was simultaneously broadcasting a clear and deliberate message to the world that negotiations might continue, but Iran's so-called red lines would not shift. Language that in strategic terms has only one real meaning, because for more than 2 decades, Tehran has defined its ballistic missile program as the core of its national defense doctrine, the single capability that compensates for inferior air power, constrains Israeli freedom of action, and places American bases throughout the region under constant threat, and this public declaration collided directly with Israeli demands that missile limitations must be mandatory in any agreement, not symbolic, not deferred, but explicit and enforceable. A position Israeli leadership formalized ahead of a critical visit to Washington, transforming diplomacy from a negotiation into an ultimatum, and placing the U.S. president into a narrowing corridor where every available option carries unacceptable consequences. Because accepting Iran's refusal risks Israeli unilateral action while backing Israeli demands guarantees diplomatic collapse and accelerates military confrontation. And this is the strategic environment in which the carrier visit must be understood, because it was not about appreciation or symbolism, but about messaging, signaling to Iran that overwhelming force remains positioned within reach, even as talks continue in name only, reassuring Israel that American military posture exists to support deterrence, even if political commitments remain ambiguous, preparing U.S. commanders for scenarios in which political decisions may require rapid operational execution and quietly warning global markets that instability is no longer theoretical, a signal investors have already begun to interpret through elevated energy risk premiums, commodity volatility, nervous equity movements, and increased hedging behavior, all unfolding against a darker strategic backdrop that senior military professionals have been warning about for years, namely, that U.S. aircraft carriers are no longer operating in uncontested environments because advances in anti-ship missile technology, hypersonic delivery systems, networked sensor fusion, and satellite-based tracking have fundamentally altered the risk calculus. And when combined with external assistance from rival powers, that have spent decades studying how to neutralize American naval dominance. The carrier transforms from an unquestioned symbol of power into a potential vulnerability, whose damage or loss would represent the most catastrophic American military event in generations, an escalation trigger so severe that it would instantly collapse any remaining political restraint. A reality military planners understand, even if civilian leaders prefer to manage it through optics rather than acknowledgement, and this is what elevates the February 8th visit from reassurance to rehearsal. Because once negotiations fail again, and all indicators suggest they will given the irreconcilable positions over missiles, Israel faces internal political pressure to act decisively as missile stockpiles expand and underground facilities harden further. Iran faces incentives to retaliate broadly rather than proportionally in order to re-establish deterrence credibility. And the United States faces the prospect of being drawn into a regional conflict not because it authorized escalation, but because its forces, bases, and assets were already positioned within the operational geometry of retaliation, a scenario planners have modeled extensively and fear privately, because once American personnel are killed, domestic political pressure eliminates restraint, and limited responses become sequential escalations. And this is why the days surrounding the Washington meetings matter more than any press briefing, because what happens after Israeli leadership departs, whether subsequent talks in Oman quietly dissolve into procedural theater, whether Israeli force posture subtly shifts, whether intelligence flights increase, whether maritime deployments tighten, all serve as indicators of whether diplomacy still has oxygen or is merely buying time. And if senior American negotiators return to that carrier again after those meetings, it will not be a morale visit but a final alignment of assumptions, authorities, and rules of engagement. Because at that point, the options under discussion will no longer be conceptual, but executable, operational, and irreversible. And February 8th will be remembered not as a routine visit, but as the moment when every serious actor involved recognized that the system had entered a compression phase where timelines shorten, decisions accelerate, and accidents carry strategic consequences, because strength was being displayed not out of confidence but necessity, and once strength is placed visibly on stage, political gravity pulls toward its use, turning diplomacy into delay management while collision dynamics continue unchecked. And this is what makes the situation so dangerous, because no side believes it can afford to concede. No side believes the other will stop voluntarily. And every side believes that waiting only worsens its strategic position, creating a closed loop of logic that rewards preemption and punishes restraint. And within that loop, the carrier is not a deterrent in isolation, but a focal point around which narratives, threats, and assumptions converge. Meaning that even an incident meant to signal resolve can instead compress decision-making cycles, harden adversary perceptions, and reduce off-ramps. And this is the paradox at the heart of the moment, because the very act of preparing for war makes war more likely. And while official language will continue to emphasize diplomacy, dialogue, and constructive engagement, the reality is that operational planning is moving faster than political compromise, that military readiness is advancing while negotiations face contracts, that markets are reacting before governments acknowledge risk, and that history shows such conditions rarely de-escalate organically, which is why observers should focus less on statements and more on movements, less on rhetoric and more on deployments, because the real story of this crisis is not being told at podiums, but unfolding quietly across airfields, command centers, naval task forces, and intelligence briefings. And when future analysts trace the path toward whatever comes next, whether conflict erupts or catastrophe is narrowly avoided, February 8th will stand out as the day when the balance tipped, not because a shot was fired, but because everyone involved understood that diplomacy was no longer shaping events, it was merely pacing them, and the carrier sitting in the Arabian Sea was no longer a bargaining chip but a commitment, whose consequences would soon test whether the system still had room for restraint or whether momentum had already taken control.